we are so honored to welcome for the first time, but not the first time in Milwaukee. And in fact, I believe I hosted the event when it was at the Harry W. Schwartz on Downer 12 years ago, but the first time at Boswell for his first novel in over 10 years, The Sun Collective. The book has been receiving amazing reviews from all over, including the early trade reviewers and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and we expect Minneapolis Star Tribune and a lot more to come. Charles Baxter is the author of Feast of Love, nominated for the National Book Award, First Life, story collections, Believers, and Through the Safety Net and others. And he has been included in Best American Short Stories. And he teaches, he has taught at Warren Wilson College, and so has our conversation partner, CJ Hribal, who is a professor at Marquette University when he is not at Warren Wilson College, and a good friend of the store. And we are just thrilled at the pairing. We're honored to have both of you here, excited about the book, and let's give them a big hand, however one does that virtually. Thank you very much. CJ, why don't you?
Sure. Welcome everybody, and I'm thrilled to be here with Charlie and to lob some questions his way and to hear him read. You can, in the chat function, post questions as well. I'll try to monitor that and pull those up as people are asking their questions. A reminder before Daniel reminds you at the end, I think he probably will, but I'll do it now. The greatest honor that you can do in the presence of an author is buy their book. And the link for that, Daniel will put in the chat. So if you haven't already gotten a copy or ordered a copy, Boswell Bookstore is the best bookstore in the country for getting your copies, and I ask you to do that. Okay, so Charlie is going to, I think, start by saying a little bit about the book, kind of setting up a description of it for us, and then maybe reading a few passages. We talked a little bit about maybe reading a little bit from the end, maybe a passage with Christina and Blue Telephone, and something from the end, and then we'll talk a little bit. So, Charlie.
Okay, thanks, CJ. I have to say that I'm still trying to get used to this. I'm looking at my screen and I feel as if I'm looking at about half of my best friends in the world. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for coming. I don't know whether it's useful to give you a plot summary. It might be useful instead just to tell you some of the things that, some of the features, the ideas that got me started on this book. And one of them was my discovery, and this is now about 5 or 6 years ago, that in the 1918 flu epidemic, there were a number of folklore cures. And one of them, and some of you have heard me read from the opening of this book, so you know about this. One of the folklore cures in 1918 for the flu epidemic was to take a mirror and drop it into flowing water and to wash your face in the river, in the water. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. That's remarkable. The second thing that got this book going was that I got wind of the fact, it was, I think in the Minneapolis paper, that as of 5 or 6 years ago, the #1 Al-Qaeda target in the United States was the Mall of America here in Minneapolis, which I thought was hilarious because I think it's such a ridiculous place. But that somehow stuck in my mind, and I began to have the idea of a novel with 2 couples, one older, they've been married for a long time, 40 years or more, and a young couple who are meeting in the course of the book. And the plot is one of those convergence narratives where the older couple meet the younger couple, and the pivot point, really, there are two of them. One of them is that the older couple's son, who has been an actor, has had a crisis in his life, and has he has dropped out of his life as an actor, and he has gone to live on the streets in Minneapolis. And his parents know that he's missing, but not missing. He's around, but not around. And that was one of the pivot points. And the other one was that I had begun to think a lot about Minneapolis political history. And for those of you who may not know it, there were riots, and riots is not even quite the right word for it. There were uprisings in 1936 in downtown Minneapolis with the truck drivers union on one side, which was mostly made up of followers of Leon Trotsky, versus a very strong fascist element in Minneapolis. Minnesota had not just Charles Lindbergh, but a large fascist following. These people were called the Silver Shirts. And there was a good deal of gunfire in downtown Minneapolis in 1936. And I think at least 4 strikers were killed. And because I began the book about 4 or 5 years ago, what happened was that I began to think about progressive movements. I began to think about what was happening to the country in the way that we were all thinking about it. And so in one sense, the book is a kind of family novel in which a family disintegrates and then is reconstituted. Formally, the book is kind of a comedy in the sense that it ends with a marriage. But on the other hand, the book is very much about what it feels like, what it has felt like, at least for me, what it has felt like to be alive for the last 4 or 5 years in the political world we've been forced to inhabit. CJ mentioned the opening of the novel. This book takes place in Minneapolis, and most of the scenes take place in locales that people in the city would notice. I love to have strangers meeting, and my central character in the beginning of the book is a guy named Harry Bredigan, who is the husband of in the older couple. His wife is Alma, and he's on the light rail on the way out to the Mall of America, not because he wants to buy anything, but because he's a member of a group of senior citizens who exercise out there. They call themselves the Thundering Herd. And so I'll just read a few paragraphs at the beginning. Harry is on the light rail, and a strange little man gets on the train. He wore a 3-piece suit, a trench coat, and a soft black trilby hat. The hat made him appear as if he were in costume. He trailed a small suitcase on wheels. His glasses consisted of small tinted circles on thin gold frames, and some property in the lenses reflected light in such a way as to make his eyes nearly invisible. Standing in the aisle next to Bredigan, bathed in soapy blue sunshine, he looked down, smiled, and asked if the seat next to Bredigan's, the one on which Bredigan's baseball cap lay, was taken. No, not at all, Bredigan said, picking up his cap and putting it on. Please, sit down. The man dropped down in slow motion next to Bredigan, lifting the crease in his trousers in an old-fashioned gesture. Thank you kindly, the man said. He had the trace of a Southern accent. Thank you, he repeated, looking straight ahead before checking his pocket watch, like the White Rabbit in Wonderland. Well, that's a kind of marker to the reader that we're about to enter a wonderland. And the doctor's name is Arvard Jefferson. And he begins to have a conversation with Bredigan. And Bredigan asks him what sort of a doctor he is. And he says he's a doctor of proton analytics. And Bredigan asks him what that is. And the doctor draws in a long breath. I'll give you an example. You see that man over there, he asked, nodding in the direction of the young couple who had followed Bredigan onto the train. The man wore earbuds and a stack of pamphlets lay in his lap. The woman seemed to be studying both Bredigan and the doctor. Yes, the doctor affirmed, that one. As soon as I get off this train, he will ask you for money. He will test you. He will beg you for something, anything. You must give him $1 at least. Do you know the legend of Notre Seigneur en pauvre, our Lord in rags? No, Bredigan said. It's a French-Canadian legend of Jesus, the doctor said with low-level excitement as he warmed to his subject. And in this legend, Jesus is dressed as a beggar and is roaming the earth, testing the generosity of everyone he meets. It is a spot quiz for your salvation. You could think of that man over there as Jesus. I recommend that you do so. Did you say that you have a medical condition? Bredigan nodded. Bredigan has a heart condition, as we discover in the course of the novel. The airport is coming up soon, the doctor said, and I shall have to be on my way, but I will tell you another legend that grew up among my people in the South. This one will help you, I guarantee. It will help you personally. Here is what you must do. What I have for you is a cure for affliction. The doctor now seemed nervously energized and was enunciating his words with care. Find a mirror, the largest one that you can easily carry, let's say a hand mirror, and take that mirror to a creek, or even better, to a flowing stream, or best of all, a river. And here's what you must do. You must lower the mirror into the water. The water has to flow over the mirror or the cure won't work. And once you have the water streaming over the glass, you wash your reflected face in the mirror, not your actual face, but your mirrored face in the water. Holding the mirror so as not to lose it, you wash your face, your reflected face, your face in the mirror, and you will get well. You will recover, and renewed, you will prosper. I give you my personal guarantee. So that is where the novel begins. And I'm going to do something that you should never do. Half of you, or almost all of you whom I'm looking at, are writers. And you know that the last thing that you should do in a reading in a bookstore or anywhere else is to read the ending of the book. But but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the ending. This is 300 pages later, when my hope is that every reader will have forgotten about what the doctor said to Bredigan. And here's Bredigan 300 pages later, coming home very ill from walking around the mall with the thundering herd. And he gets on the light rail. And this is what happens. On the light rail, headed toward Minneapolis, Bredigan let the sun shine on his face, and once again the light had acquired a blue tint from the advertising sheath that covered the exterior of the train car. When he glanced at his hands, he noticed that they appeared to be slightly blue, as if bruised. The train burst out of the tunnel into the light and stopped at Fort Snelling, where an old woman with a prominent bald spot got on, giving Bredigan an aura of pain around his heart. At the next stop, at the VA hospital, a war-torn African-American man with the US Army Iraq war badge on his jacket sleeve came hobbling in, supported by a crutch on his left-hand side. His other sleeve displayed a marksmanship medal with a cross and a circle surrounding it. On his neck was a cross tattoo, and another cross hung down on the leather band over his chest. He wore an outsized black boot over his left foot, large enough to surround the wound dressing that was surely enfolded underneath the leather. Under his crutch, using his crutch, his face a mask of pain that, as the old preachers used to say, would make Jesus weep. He headed toward the front of the car where he engaged the first set of passengers in conversation. The train continued toward Minneapolis, passing several grain elevators lit by the mid-morning sun. In the distance, a dog ran down the sidewalk, followed by a red-haired boy on roller skates. Bredigan closed his eyes. Sir? Bredigan opened his eyes. Yes? It was the war-torn veteran. I am very sorry to bother you, he said. This is embarrassing for me, but I wonder if you have any spare change, or perhaps $1. Please, whatever you can spare for a meal. The pain, which had been located in Bredigan's chest, had moved out to his left arm and his neck, becoming its own universe. And with some difficulty, he reached behind for his wallet, which he extracted from his trousers and opened in front of the veteran. Inside it were 4 $20 bills and 2 singles. He took them out and handed them over. Here, take them, Bredigan said. The veteran studied the bills in Bredigan's hand, and his eyes widened. Please, sir, he said, no jokes. I'm serious, take it. That's, you mean? Take them. I do mean it. Here, $82. It's not a fortune. It's just $82. Bredigan was beginning to wave the money back and forth and then stopped the motion because it hurt. I insist. Very gingerly, the veteran reached out to take the money. Here, Bredigan said, take my wallet. Take the credit card. Go ahead, use it. I don't need it anymore. He held out his wallet. The veteran stared at him. I came naked into the world, and naked I will leave it, Bredigan told him. No, I ain't no thief, the veteran said, rubbing his beard stubble. No, I know, you're not, Bredigan said to him. Okay, don't use the credit card, I get it. There's just one thing I ask. What? I want a blessing, Bredigan told him. Give me a blessing. Why? I'm in pain. You've been in the war too, man. It shows on you. You know what I'm saying? Well, all right. God bless you, sir. Thank you. But I can't take your wallet, the veteran told him. Sure you can. Where's your stop? The veteran glanced out the window. Next one, Cedar Riverside. Take my wallet. If you don't want it, just toss it in the trash, but I'd rather you keep it. You are one crazy motherfucker, the veteran said with an expression of deep pity. What's your thing got you here? This is your stop, Bredigan said as the train slowed. Thank you, the veteran said. I ain't gonna forget you, ever. No shit. Yes, Bredigan said, I know. The man limped out of the car after the doors chimed open, and Bredigan watched as he stood pensively next to a trash container before pocketing the $82 and tossing the wallet into the container's open mouth. The doors chimed shut, and Bredigan closed his eyes as an involuntary movement took control of his left leg. A chill rose up his body. Abends will ich schlafen gehen. Evenings, I will go to bed. The train made a slight turn leftward past a private novelty museum. House of balls where carved bowling balls with faces of cherubs and devils were on display, and then a paint factory whose exterior had been coated with primary colors. A large football stadium in the shape of a Viking ship loomed up on the left, and the train moved through several switches, lurching slightly as it approached the stop for the stadium, where several people boarded, including a woman pushing a small shopping cart on wheels. She glanced at the man with his eyes closed and took her seat close to the door. Above the train, a flock of sparrows appear to be fighting with each other or are engaged in a mating ritual. Their collective mind takes them in the direction of a small city park in which office workers are even now spreading quilts out on the grass so they can sit down and eat a midday sandwich. 4 young men are playing hacky sack on the north end of the park. A light breeze cools the air, and overhead an airplane headed southeast gradually descends for its landing at the airport. Gazing down from the plane, a passenger unfamiliar with the city and the Midwest might spy a commuter train, the light rail, making its way downtown toward Target Field. Is it inward or outward bound? It would be hard to say. But the chief flight attendant has just announced that everyone must secure their tray tables and move their seats to the upright position. We will be landing shortly, she says, so the passenger quickly gathers up his odds and ends of flight mini garbage and hands it all to the attendant walking down the aisle and carrying a trash bag. The city looks great from the air, a place of lakes and a river, the Mississippi, that flows all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, cutting down the middle of the country like an incision over its heart. So that's the end. That's the end of the book. That's the beginning and the end of the book. CJ, I think I probably, that's enough reading for a while.
Sure.
I'll just say that the tone of the scenes in which Christina appears is very, very different. It's much more, what would you say, hallucinogenic.
Yeah. There's these great descriptions. It's one of my favorite things in the book are her perceptions on a drug that's kind of an ecstasy-like drug called blue telephone. But I'll let people enjoy that or discover that on their own. I'm thinking about that ending, and just the feeling as it was coming together. I've known you for 35 years, I think. I think we met in the spring of 1985. And I've been blown away by all your work, your stories, essays, poems, novels, critical work. This novel seems to coalesce some of your most poignant, your most insightful, most inventive, most dangerous writing. It feels quietly monumental in the way that I think, when I read Chekhov, it feels like that. And I just wondered, because you talked a little bit at the beginning about, what you started with. How did the parts start coming together for you for this? Did you have a sense of what you were constructing as it was happening, or was it just, could you say a little bit about that process?
No, I had no idea. When I started, I thought, what did I think? I honestly, so many of you are writers, and you know how this is. I had a vague idea of where I wanted the novel to go. I wanted it not to be neat. I wanted something like a loose, baggy monster that I could empty my pockets into. Everything that I had, I wanted to put into it. And I felt that I had gained a kind of advantage by, I'll just say this, by getting old. And by getting old, I thought nobody, I'm trying to put this correctly. I can do anything I want to do in this book. I don't care anymore about my reputation. I don't care that much about reviews. I want to take all the chances that I can. And one of the chances that I wanted to take was to start the book in what looked like realism, and then to take it off into realism that's running a low grade and sometimes high grade fever, so that it isn't really realism anymore. And what fed into this was the experience that all of us have shared of what the last 4 or 5 years have been like. And my experience walking around Minneapolis and standing on the light rail stop and talking to homeless people. A lot of the conversations, some of the homeless people whom I know and who are mostly on the Nicollet Mall are mostly guys, a couple of women, but mostly guys I've sort of gotten to know. And a lot of the conversations I had with them went into the book. And finally, I thought what this book is, one of the things that this book is about is trying to, it has to do with trying to keep yourself together under the hardest possible circumstances. And it's also about what you do, what anybody does when you're walking around an American city and people who are helpless come up to you and ask for your help. That's really the sort of the emotional center of this book, those different things. And I did my best to find a plot that was compendious enough so that I could put all of these preoccupations of mine into it. So that's a kind of roundabout answer to your question, but that's kind of how the book got itself written.
Okay, yeah, Dean actually in the chat has says, Charlie, you once told me a few years ago that you just kept putting everything into the novel. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of you know me, or many of you know me, and you know that I love the short story. I love the short story form, but the short story form is largely subtractive. When you're writing a short story, you just sit there and you're writing, and you don't use this, and you don't use that, and you don't use this, and you don't use that. And there's this one thing that you can use. because the short story is such a demanding form. And I thought, when I was working on this novel, I thought, fuck that. I'm not going to write this book that way. If something occurs to me, I'm going to put it in. And the result of that was that when I first turned it in to my agent and my editor, Dan Frank, it was about 150 pages longer than it is now. But I thought writing this book was going to take me the rest of my life. And some of you I know I talked to while I was working on it, and you'd say, how's it going? And I would say, oh, it's going. I just think it's going to take me the rest of my life. And as it happened, it took about 6 years.
Kind of feeding off of that. I mean, I people probably can't see, but this is my ARC copy of it, with like every other page dog-eared of things that I want to write into my commonplace book of just great lines. I mean, there's a part of me as I was reading all these great lines and observations that it feels like you could craft an entire book of nothing but great lines from this. Chris Castellani, who's here actually on Facebook, posted one of his favorite lines in one of his posts, and I've got a ton of them. But I was just curious because actually maybe this speaks to it being 150 pages longer than it actually is how conscious, I guess, as you were doing this, were you of writing these great lines, these observations that are just so powerful in a line or a paragraph that feel like they could, be whole essays onto themselves. It almost feels like you said to yourself, I'm just going to tell people everything about everything, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to be sad, and it's going to be poignant, and it's going to be jarring, and it's going to be mysterious, and people are going to be amazed at all the shocks of recognition. So here's what my question is as you're doing this, how do you decide what you're leaving out when you're trying to include everything?
Well, you do what I think most writers do, which is every time you start in the morning, you go back over what you wrote the day before that, or the day before that, and you look at your own writing and you pay attention to the sentences that bore you and that you pass over. They're not interesting sentences, they're boring. Out they go. I mean, if you wrote the sentence and the sentence bores you, it's going to bore everybody else. So, the first thing I do in the morning is cut out a lot of the stuff that I wrote the day before that. But the process of writing this book was one in which I gave myself a lot of permission to say what I wanted to say. And a lot of that had to do with the strangeness of the world these people inhabited, and the way that something that crept into my thinking, and Chris Castellani, my dear friend, a wonderful writer, mentioned this on Facebook, is a kind of nostalgia that a lot of us were beginning to feel for reality. As if the lives we are leading now have somehow escaped the bounds of reality, and we're living in some other condition. One of the characters says, I miss realism. And as I was writing, I was thinking a lot about realism, the sort of writing that many of us have written or loved reading when we were growing up and becoming attached to literature. And I was thinking that realism makes sense when there's a kind of consensus about what reality is. And it has seemed to me that not only are we grappling with what feels like an erasure of the future, we also have a sense that nobody agrees about what reality is anymore. And if that's true, or at least what was true for me when I was writing this book, was that I didn't want to write a novel whose temperature was 98.6. I wanted to write a book that was running a low grade and sometimes a high grade fever. The line, I think I may have it, that Chris.
The one that Chris pointed out is in the chat. He put it in the chat. If that's the one.
It's in the chat. Okay. Thanks,
yeah,
Chris.
Yeah, I'll read it in case people don't have the chat open. Realism was over. It had crumbled. This was the world we had now. This duplicate, the realm of unlikeness, even here on Haas Street, where nothing solid remained and bogus birds shrieked in the cardboard trees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But here's the thing, because I was curious about this, because you're walking a razor's edge between this realism and this unreality. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but from a lecture you gave a few years ago, you talked about the need for writers to preserve the memory of how people live or lived, and you use as the example the kitchen in William Maxwell's So Long, See You Tomorrow, and talked about the way in which the detailing of that was really important, and it seems to be something you've really focused on, in the book, and that it's a book grounded very much in our times. I mean, politicians that we can recognize, they go by different names here, but they make cameo appearances. There's a bodybuilding Speaker of the House, for instance, and kind of an Ayn Rand cameo under a different name. But it's not about that, or it's only about that peripherally. There is this realistic detailing of how people live now, but it's also about this anxiety, unreality that we all feel, and so you're working with both. And one of the things that I was just curious in terms of you're thinking about it, because it shows up in different ways. I mean, each of the different characters, I think, ends up having some kind of either a vision of one kind or another. Christina's are drug-induced. Bredigan has that dream of being a murderer. Alma, after a stroke or a mental stroke, talks to Woland, her dog, and the cat Behemoth. Tim, her son, and the Bredigan son, has a psychic break, et cetera. So I was curious, did you kind of, when you're trying to talk about that unreality, did you want to have each of these characters have their own kind of way in which they left realism behind?
Yeah, but I think if characters are going to leave realism behind, it's the place they have to start from. On the screen I'm looking at, I can see a lot of my fellow faculty members at Warren Wilson and some students there. And one of the talks that I gave at Warren Wilson, and I think at Breadloaf, had to do with taking inventories. It's related to, CJ, what you're talking about in the kitchen in Maxwell's So Long, See You Tomorrow, and the importance of getting down on paper the sorts of things that characters have, the objects, the physical objects that they have in their lives surrounding them. And so I was very careful when we're in Christina's living room to detail the kind of furniture and the albums that she has there, old LPs and the CDs that she has collected. It's the same with Bredigan. It's the same with all of the characters. But another talk that I also gave at Warren Wilson had to do with what I called Wonderlands. It seems to me that much of the fiction that has interested me the most in the last, I would say, 10 years takes you, and I'm thinking of people like Murakami here, but there's a great deal of this in African-American writing, worlds in which it seems as if the rules that you thought you knew don't apply anymore, and somebody is in charge, but whoever it is won't reveal him or themselves. The Wonderland operates under a kind of logic, but it's very hard to get at it. So those two things, I'm sorry I'm getting so long-winded. The inventory matches up with the Wonderland. One makes the other possible, I think.
Kind of a related question to that. A lot of us here have had the pleasure of being taught by you or listening to and reading your craft lectures over the years. And I was struck by how much you're thinking about craft. I think of like little moments from various craft talks and essays you've written find their way into the novel. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how aspects of your thinking about story found their way into this novel. For example, when you're talking about the Wonderland, I immediately thought of the character Y and Ludlow, who are both what I think are of as Captain Happen kind of characters.
Yeah.
And you had pioneered that phrase, and there's references as well to, there's it's mentioned in a Christina section, but it's present in other places in the book. The idea of one-way gates, right. and right. The request.
Yeah. I'll try to do this in 3 minutes.
Take your time.
Captain Happen is that figure in your fiction who's volatile, who will say things that nobody else will say, and who will do things that nobody else will do. Captain Happen always moves the story forward. And when things start to get dull, you can say, where's Captain Happen? In my case, when in doubt, when my scenes aren't going anywhere, what do? I have one character turn to another character and ask that, and I have that character ask the other one, there's something I want you to do. It's the request moment. This novel begins with a request moment, with Arthur Jefferson saying, here's something I want you to do. I want you to wash your face on the mirror in the water. The one-way gate for me is the biggest mental tool I have for engineering a plot, which is simply to make characters do or say something that there's no going back from. Having said or having done what they have said or done is definitive, and they can't take it back. Maybe in a Christian universe, they can be forgiven for it. But I'm always trying to think of a way of getting the characters to do something definitive. And that's the one-way gate. And to use one other element, I mean, I've learned so much listening to my colleagues at Warren Wilson and elsewhere. And at Warren Wilson, we used to talk a great deal about the story clock and setting the story clock. And what does that mean? It just means that the characters are going to run out of time. They have to run out of time. There cannot be enough. If there's something they have to do it sooner rather than later. Because if they have all the time in the world, all the urgency drains out of the story. So I'm also conscious of of the story clock, those of you who have read the novel know that Christina, who I think Christina is in a sense, or is the hero of this book, has to do something because her boyfriend, Ludlow, she believes, with I think pretty good evidence, Ludlow is going to do something terrible, and she has to stop it. So those are some of the elements that went into my thinking as I was trying to figure out how to structure this book.
I want to remind people, because the time is getting short here. If you've got questions, put them in the chat, and I'll bring them up. There's one here that was posted early, and I want to get to it. It's a very specific question, but I think it maybe speaks to something larger as well. This is from Mark Putsey, who writes, in the late 80s, you read at UW Milwaukee in front of grad students in the English department. I'd never read you, but attended the reading because I'd been introduced to you by one of the students, a young lady who was editing the Cream City Review at the time. You read 2 stories, the second of which struck me deeply because the narrator made a revelatory statement. He said it made no sense to contribute to the MD telethon since muscular dystrophy was a genetic disorder and therefore incurable. Did you ever consider doing a companion piece to the story with the same narrator, given advances in genetic engineering? I'm going to, rather than put you on the spot on that particular question, actually ask you about the idea of you're sometimes returning to characters anyway, like with Saul and Patsy, and in your work, because you do sometimes return to characters and pick up and revisit their lives.
Well, I do, but it's a kind of writerly ecology. I mean, if you've gone to the trouble of thinking up a character, why should you leave that character behind when the story is over? Why can't you bring the character back, maybe as a minor character in another story? I think the writing of fiction is often very wasteful. You think of these wonderful people, and then you leave them behind. I mean, all of you know, if you've written a novel and you finish the novel, there's sometimes a feeling of postpartum depression because you think, oh, I'm not going to be living with those people anymore. Well, why not bring them back? I don't know, I'm being kind of facetious about this, but I felt when in the previous book, there's something I want you to do. It was my first Minneapolis book, and I was very fond. I loved those characters. I just loved them. And in fact, one of them, Dr. Elijah Elliott Jones, is in this novel. He's an extremely minor character. You hardly see him. He's in the Thundering Herd, and he shows up at the bar with Redigan. But he's a character in my previous book, and I just wanted to bring him back. Who's going to stop me?
Yeah. And I think Joan Silber, who's actually on this call, I mean, constructs whole books that way,
Oh, sure. Yeah, Joan has just made these beautiful constructions, these, I think they're called novitas, of linked stories where you're kind of following out a set of themes and characters whom you may have seen in the first story will turn up later, sometimes in the last story. It's beautiful. I love that form.
Question from Stacy Durasmo. Charlie, given the extremity of the times and the strangeness, how do you see the art of fiction? By which I guess I mean, what next? What has traction?
Stacy, I wish you would answer that for me. I do have to say that what has traction for me has to do with the way that my reading habits have changed in the last, let's say, 6 months. In January, February, I was reading the way I usually read. Books of short stories, novels, I would race through them. And now that we're all inside and we are all, or at least I'm doing much more reading because I'm not going to movies, I'm not going to concerts, I'm not going to plays, I'm not going to see professional dancers. I sit in this chair over here, and books that looked too long to me in the past look like comfortable refuges. It's going to take a long time to read this book. Fine. These characters are going to take forever to make themselves known on the page. Great. There's a 1,000-page summary of Dostoevsky's life by Joseph Frank. Bring it on, I'll read it. I'm not in a hurry anymore. Of course, I'm also retired. But this has slowed down my time sense and my reader's sense. You know, when I turn on MSNBC, I feel as frantic as I ever did. But what has traction for me is slow art in a way that that slow art hadn't appealed to me in the same way as it does now. So, I mean, that's a very idiosyncratic answer, I think, but I'm very patient with books now.
Here's a question from one of my current students, Ricardo Milo. For young writers, what's your best advice to them? Specifics on the writing process, quirky routines that get your mind rolling. What has helped you through all these years?
Well, you know, Retke said in his notebooks, get down to where your obsessions are. That's a good place to start. Get down to where your involuntary memories are, the things that you think of that come to you unbidden. Think about the things that you aren't brave enough to say to your friends and find a way of converting those things into statements in your fiction that the characters may say to each other. Don Bartholomew's advice to everybody was to read everything, and that's good advice. But I don't know, what we're trying to do is to create texts that are full of truth and beauty. And I think that comes from the sorts of materials that ordinarily you would feel like hiding away. I feel that very strongly. Great fiction often comes out of our secret lives.
Jessica DePriest asks, you've touched on this, you know, in just a few moments ago, but is there more to it in terms of what is something you wish you'd known 20 years ago about writing that you know now?
It's a great question. And, you know, when I was younger, I don't want to be glib about this. I think it's a terribly important question. But I think it's not so much about what I know about writing that I know now. It's more what I know about life and human behavior that I know now that I didn't know 40 years ago. And I suppose in some ways this is related to the means by which we've fashioned plots. But I guess I would say that as I grow older, what I think about is the way that actions have consequences. When I was young, I didn't think about that. When you're young, I just don't think that you do. You don't think of your actions as being consequential. And it's that great feeling of freedom that you have when you're young. And when you're older, you just think, that thing that I did, or that action that I saw that person do, has had ramifications that have lasted and lasted and lasted. And that's related to the way that we plot out stories, the consequences of actions.
I'm going to ask one final question and then call Dan back because I think he has some things he wants to say right at the end here. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I'll probably say that again in a minute.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
You're doing this at a kind of momentous point in your life too, because I just saw an article about the fact that you're going to be retiring from teaching at the University of Minnesota.
I have retired.
So first off on that, congratulations. What do you think that means for your writing and for your thinking about writing?
I think it means that I don't, when I'm reading a novel, I don't have to think about it as schematically as I once did. I can just go flowing on the river of story. I don't see myself giving more craft talks. I think I've done enough of that. So the result for me is that I just have become an amateur reader. And I will keep my thoughts to myself from now
on. Dan is back, and Dan, are there things you want to say? And I just want to remind people, and I think you're going to do it again anyway, but the link to buy this book is in the chat, and for all of your book buying needs, whatever Charlie Baxter book you want to buy.
CJ, can I say one thing?
They're all available as well. Yeah.
For people who think that the choice of the name of the dog and the cat in my novel may be strange, Woland and Behemoth, they're straight out of this novel, The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, which if any book was a model for what I wanted to do, it's this one. And the names of the dog and the cat are just imported from that novel. Sorry, I had to do a little product placement here.
Well, Bulgakov will be very grateful for that. We are selling the book. We have book plates. We are always grateful for purchase. We know folks are also from all over the country, and we would be very happy if you bought it from your local bookstore. I wouldn't mind if you said Daniel told me to, but get a little plug, and it would make whatever books are amused. But wherever you get it, just get it. And it's a wonderful book. And we're so grateful that you shared the evening with us. We're always grateful to CJ for what he does and his writing and his teaching. And I've read a lot of your books in the audience as well, and looking forward to some coming out next year. So thank you. Wonderful evening. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. So thank you very much. Congratulations.
Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.